Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Well, what a great Wednesday. Coming off a couple of days of vacation, feeling pretty good, feeling strong. Quick reminder, tomorrow, 6 a.m., Thursday, the Coffee and Coaches conference call. Please join us for that. There is no charge for that, of course. And it's great conversation, great people all over the country are joining us on that one. So that's always fun. I want to dig right into the Q&A. Wednesday is always a tight day, but we got a great question for the live comeback this week, and it comes from Johnny. And Johnny says, if propulsion and force production are both biased into internal rotation, would the hip still move through its ER from the bottom of a squat to standing, or would it remain an IR bias throughout the range of motion? This is great. This is a great question. I think, Johnny, you already know the answer based on the way that you asked it, but it's a very useful question because it's gonna provide us an opportunity to talk about some cool things about squatting, like sticking points and the pelvic diaphragm. So let's go through this real quick. So let's talk about the hip range of motion first. So if we were talking about traditional hip flexion, as we move through hip flexion, we're going to have an external rotation bias in this early phase of flexion as we go through the middle range, so 90 degrees plus or minus 30 on each end. We're going to talk about an internal rotation bias, and then we're going to have an external rotation bias again at the top. If we're looking at the shape of the pelvic diaphragm, or shape of the pelvis as we go through this, we're going to go through an inhaled position as we're ER'd. We're going to go through an exhaled position as we're IR'd, and then again we're going to go through the inhaled position. Now that's just range of motion. We're not talking specifically about squatting, and it does look like we should go through those phases during a squat, and in some cases we do have people that are able to achieve that. But when we're talking about loaded squats and the need for higher force production, depending on those demands, we're going to have to bias ourselves towards a position that does allow us to produce more force. And so under those circumstances, Johnny, you're absolutely correct. We're going to maintain more of an internal rotation bias as we squat, especially with load. And so let's talk about the sticking point a little bit, because this is where a lot of this is going to show up, because this is where we have to produce some of the higher forces. So this 90 degree plus or minus 30 that's traditionally referred to as the sticking point, which is our IR bias, it's our exhalation bias, it's an exhalation strategy, high levels of compression, and it's also going to be our max propulsive phase during the squat. And the reason that we need this is because we have the force of the load that is external, plus we have internal forces that are trying to drive downward through the pelvis. And so for us to achieve a level of depth under certain circumstances, we're going to have to eccentrically orient the pelvic diaphragm to a degree to allow us to achieve the hip range of motion to capture depth. However, as we push back up, we have to concentrically orient that pelvic diaphragm. So if the pelvic diaphragm goes up, we get to go up too. So we get to push ourselves up out of that squat. If the pelvic diaphragm is going down, guess what? We are going down too. And so those of you that ever lifted a heavy weight in a squat and missed a lift where you started to come up and you just couldn't overcome those internal forces and you end up going right back down to the bottom of the squat, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so again, we have to create this situation where we can achieve a concentric pelvic diaphragm. That requires that we have hip internal rotation available to us, because what that's going to do, it's going to help maintain this exhaled position, the concentric pelvic diaphragm, the high pressure strategy that allows us to stand back up. So this is why you're going to see any number of deviations in a squat. So you'll see people that will move their knees outward, and what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to maintain this internal rotation position of the hip joint to help us maintain the concentric orientation of this pelvic diaphragm. If we release it too much, again, we're going to descend into squat. This is why you'll see powerlifters squat the way that they do, because they don't want to deviate from their concentric orientation to the slightest degree, because the more eccentrically oriented they are, the faster they're going to go down, the less control they have, and it's going to make the turnaround very, very difficult for them. You'll see Olympic weightlifters will bounce out of the bottom of their squat, and what they're doing is they're trying to unweight themselves internally, which allows them to sort of elevate quickly. They can capture the concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm and then finish their lift as well. So how much internal rotation and external rotation you're able to achieve during the squat is going to be context dependent. So at high levels of activation of musculature, there's a much smaller length change. And so if we're doing a heavy squat, you're going to maintain that IR bias almost throughout the entire thing, because I have to maintain some measure of higher force production. And so again, I'm going to remain concentrically oriented. Like I said, the length change is going to change very little, because the more length change I have, chances are the faster I'm going to go down into that squat. If body weight is challenging for you all by itself, then chances are you're going to see somebody that's going to have an internal rotation bias to even their body weight squat. And so again, it becomes very context dependent. So the strategy is going to change under load. If you're interested, there's a sequence of a squat workout by Lu Xiaojun, who's a Chinese weightlifter. He's an Olympic champion. You'll know it's him because he is Chinese. And then he also squats. He also trains and lifts with very bright gold shoes. And so if you watch the sequence, there's actually a whole picture sequence of a squat workout where he's at low weights and then high weights. You'll actually see the deviations in his squat. So Johnny, great question to start us off for the live stuff this week. And I appreciate you asking that question. Hope I answered it for you sufficiently. If I haven't, ask another question at askbillhartman@gmail.com. Everybody have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow on the Coffee and Coaches conference call. See ya.